Hi guys, I've just released version 2 of Dynavision and the main change is the inclusion of an MCM, the mod configuration menu, a user-friendly menu that allows you to change the settings of the mod without going through a settings holotape. All of the settings are here. Now, for those of you that don't know what this mod is, it gives you dynamic depth of field. If you look at this sign and then look at the background, you'll see the background is blurred, where if I look at the background, it will come into focus just in time for the weather to get a bit foggy. But you get the idea. I look back at the sign and the sign comes into focus and the background starts to blur. And there you go. So it's as simple as that. It basically gives you a photographic effect. There are a lot of different settings you can use to tweak this to your liking. Perhaps you only want a slight blur. You can change the main strength to say 0.7, and this will make it a little softer in the background, as you can see. The full version of the dynamic depth of field will actually blur foreground objects if you look into the distance. If you look at the car down below, it is now out of focus until I look at it once more. However, you can change this behavior by switching to something known as light dynamic depth of field, which will only blur the background objects. You can see the car clearly now when looking at the distance, but when I look at the car, you'll see the distant objects do blur. So if you prefer that kind of behavior, you can do that. That mode is also slightly less performance hungry. This is a very light mod. Even at the full setting, most PCs should be able to handle it without even a frame rate drop, without even one frame drop. However, I did create the mod to be used on an Xbox as well, and that mode was designed for that console. You do have that on PC if you prefer that functionality. If you want the full option though, with foreground objects blurred, you can. There are also static options. If all you want is the background blurred pretty much permanently, you can have, say, a static long-range depth of field, and what this will do is make the distant objects, as you can see, blurred, but it won't matter where you look. It's always blurred. The strength, once again, is decided in the mod configuration menu. So if you just want a slight blur, just to make the distant terrain look a little better, maybe 0.5, you can do that. And it just gives it a bit of a hazy look. If you don't like the textures at the if you don't like textures on distant objects, you can, hide them a little. And the short range static depth of field is exactly that. You'll see the blur applied a lot closer. It's not as noticeable at this strength. If I change it back to 1.1, you'll see straight away it does blur quite a lot. That's not something I would use, but maybe you really do not like the textures beyond a few hundred meters. Obviously, the dynamic depth of field has more options, including the speed at which the depth of field focuses. You can actually make it very, very slow indeed. 0.5 is the slowest, and what this will mean is the background will blur exceptionally slowly. As you can see, it's getting a little more blurred as I talk. And this will mean if you look at something long enough, you will get a photographic effect. If I look to the distance now, the distant terrain comes into focus quickly, but the foreground objects will take some time before they begin to blur. You can see it now. So it's a lot smoother, and it really only kicks in when you spend a lot of time looking at things. This is great for people who don't like the effect too much, but occasionally do like to just gaze off into the distance or look lovingly at a wrecked car and focus on it completely. Obviously, you can also change that so that it does it a lot faster. There is even an option to make it harsh. I don't like this, but it pretty much snaps it in and out very quickly. I do not like that. I do not recommend it. If you want it to be fast, I would still use the smooth setting. I would just crank it up a little, maybe 3.5 or 4, or even 5. 5 is pretty abrupt, but it's, it's not too bad. One thing I can tell you is things will focus almost immediately. So even if the blur takes some time to apply, you will be able to look down and then look up and see whatever you're looking at and shooting at, for example, pretty much instantly. It's just the blur that takes a little time. If you want a different strength inside, you can. The main strength is for outside. The interiors is a completely different setting. However, the combat multiplier and the running multiplier are actually something that is applied on top of those. So for example, I've got mine set to 0.5. This means the blur effect will only be half as strong whilst I'm in combat. And indeed, if I'm running, and since I generally move whilst running is toggled, that's mostly when I'm moving, it will be almost half strength. What this means is if I'm looking at something and you can see the terrain in the background getting blurred, and then I start moving, that terrain will actually get a little sharper into focus until I stop moving, and then it will fade a little more. It's not that easy to see, and it really only becomes massively apparent when you look at very close objects. This makes it so that if you're running around trying to find things and loot things, the blur is less pronounced. I find that somewhat easier to play with. And of course, you can now remove the settings holotape. There's no real need to have that holotape if you are using MCM. Select this and the holotape will be removed from your inventory. It says Dynavision removed. It means the settings holotape. So now I have slightly less holotapes in my inventory. If you've been using a previous version of Dynavision, don't worry, you can just upgrade without doing any changes whatsoever. The mod will detect the change, make what little changes it needs to make, and add the MCM for you. So just update the mod and don't even think about it. If you're new to the mod, when you first start the game up, you will need to go into the MCM and enable it because it will come set to off at the start. And I would recommend, if you ever decide to uninstall the mod, it's good practice to switch it off first and then save your game and uninstall the mod. It's not essential, but I would say it was good practice, so I'm going to recommend that you do that. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoy the mod. Feel free to leave me comments down below and I will try to keep on top of them if there are any issues that need to be dealt with.